Earlier this year, a member of our wine tasting group was generous enough to share a bottle of 1991 Loire Premier Cru Burgundy with us. This wine was absolutely mind-blowing, and it motivated me to learn more about Loire. So in this video, I'm going to share what I've learned with you. I'm going to start out by discussing Loire's history, then get into its approach to grape growing and winemaking. I'll then provide an overview of their exceptional vineyard holdings, which will give you an idea of which bottlings that they produce. And after that, I'm going to discuss what the wines taste like, as well as the reasons why they're so incredibly expensive. Loire traces its roots way back to 1868, at which time Francois Loire founded Maison Loire. Francois had been a grower with some vineyard holdings in Burgundy, but he wanted to expand his production, so he established a negociant business and began producing wine from source fruit as well. In 1932, Francois' grandson, Henri, had a child who went by the name of Lalou. Reportedly, Lalou's love for wine began when she was a child because Henri rubbed a few drops of 1929 Musigny over her lips. Importantly, Henri also purchased a 50% ownership stake in famed producer Domaine de la Romanée-Conti in 1943, which was certainly a very smart investment. Lalou Loire joined the family business in 1955 and became CEO in 1971. In addition to running Maison Loire, Lalou also accompanied her father on visits to Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. In fact, from 1974 to early 1992, Ms. Loire also co-managed DRC with Aubert du Vallin. But they had a falling out, and so they parted ways, although Ms. Loire reportedly still owns 25% of DRC. In the 1980s, Ms. Loire found it increasingly difficult to be able to source fruit that met her lofty standards. Among other things, she thought that the grapes were producing wines that were too thin because the yields were too high, and she also wanted to use organic methods in the vineyard. As a result, in 1988, she went on a buying spree and purchased a number of vineyards in Burgundy and established Domaine Loire. Domaine Loire produces wine from its estate vineyards, and in all, it has right around 22 hectares of vineyard holdings. One of the reasons that Domaine Loire wine is so special is because it has some exceptional vineyard sources, including some of the most prestigious sources, not just in Burgundy, but in the entire world. Due to the extensive nature of Loire's holdings at all four classification levels in Burgundy, I'm not going to discuss each of them individually, but I am going to include each of them on a slide in case you'd like to use that as a resource and to just briefly discuss some of the highlights in each classification level. Of course, Grand Cru is the highest classification in Burgundy, and only 1% of wine that's produced in Burgundy is Grand Cru. Impressively, Loire has 9 different vineyard holdings that are classified as Grand Cru. Certainly when you're talking about Loire's Grand Cru holdings, Richebourg and Romney-Saint-Vivant definitely jump out, and it's extremely impressive that Loire is the second largest holder in each of these extremely prestigious AOCs. Moving on to the second highest tier in the Burgundy classification, Loire also has 8 Premier Crus. Notably, Les Beaumont in Vosne-Romanée is its largest vineyard holding at 2.61 hectares. While I am always overjoyed to try any Loire wines, it is the Loire wines produced from the vineyard holdings in the Grand Cru and Premier Cru locations that are on these first 2 slides that are most in demand and most coveted by collectors and investors. Moving down a tier from Premier Cru, Loire also has 9 holdings that are classified at the village level. These wines can be particularly special during years when Loire declassifies some fruit from the higher tiers and includes it in the village wines. In 2004, for example, Loire decided not to make any Grand Cru or Premier Cru bottlings and instead declassified all that fruit and put it into the village wines. Loire also has 5 holdings at the lowest tier in Burgundy, which is the regional or generic appellation level. Wines produced from these holdings are typically the lowest priced Domaine Loire wines and the best way for you to be able to try a Domaine Loire wine without spending significant sums of money. Another reason that Loire wines are so special is because of the meticulous vineyard management practices implemented by Ms. Bize-Leroy. She's a big believer in both organic and biodynamic farming. In fact, shortly after she purchased the vineyards in 1988, she immediately converted them to organic farming, and following the 1988 harvest, she implemented biodynamic practices as well. Among other things, this means that Ms. Bize-Leroy prohibited all use of chemicals in the vineyard. So no insecticides, no fungicides, no pesticides, and no herbicides. While this is relatively commonplace today, it was extremely unusual back in the late 1980s, and that's particularly true for Burgundy, where they get some substantial bad weather and they have lots of problems with conditions such as mildew during the growing season. In addition, in places like Bordeaux, when wineries convert to biodynamic and organic farming methods, they typically do so gradually on a plot-by-plot basis over an extended period of time. But Ms. Bize-Leroy was so convinced that it was the right thing to do, she did not do any testing whatsoever, but instead just went ahead and converted 100% of her vineyard holdings to organic and then biodynamic farming methods. Another story that illustrates just how confident Ms. Bize-Leroy is in organic and biodynamic farming methods is the story regarding the 1993 vintage. That was an extremely difficult vintage in Burgundy due to a pervasive mildew problem. Many producers were spraying chemical treatments to try to address the mildew problem, and they were doing so quite aggressively. Ms. Bize-Leroy, however, stuck to only her organic and biodynamic techniques to try to prevent the damage from the mildew. This is so even though her winemaker and a number of other team members were imploring her to use chemical treatments to salvage the vintage and to try to preserve some of the fruit for harvest. But as a result, she had an extremely modest harvest in 1993 and lost a lot of the fruit, and with it, the potential to earn a lot more money than she could have had she used chemical treatments just to try to salvage that vintage. Ultimately, the Domaine Loire wines produced in 1993 were of exceptional quality, although the volume was quite small. Loire's vineyard management practices are designed with the goal of producing the highest quality fruit possible and of producing fruit that will result in wines that are reflective of the site. Some specific methods that they use in the vineyard that help them to achieve these goals include using compost preparations to treat both the soils and the grapevines. They're also extremely careful about compacting the soil, and so they use extremely light vehicles when they work in the vineyard. A couple decades ago, Ms. Bize-Leroy also stopped trimming the vine shoots, but instead started to curl the vine tips around the top wire on the trellis. Ms. Bize-Leroy believes that this technique helps to reduce stress on the vine and also helps to preserve the terminal buds. Ms. Bize-Leroy also does not do any general replanting programs. Instead, she replaces vines individually as needed. As a result, the vineyards have vines of varying ages interspersed throughout. So you could have a situation where you have an extremely old vine planted right next to a vine that was just planted a few weeks ago. This approach also results in average vine age that is much higher at Loire than for some other Burgundy producers. Specifically, in the case of Loire, the vines average an impressive 60 years of age. Due to the average age of the vines, the farming techniques used by Ms. Bize-Leroy, and the extremely strict selection process at harvest, the production volumes for Loire are only about 1/2 to 1/3 of the volumes produced by many other producers in Burgundy. This means that on average, Loire produces only around 2,700 cases of wines per year, but this also varies wildly from vintage to vintage, and it's been as low as 1,700 and as high as 3,500 cases per vintage. This low volume of production also helps to explain one reason why Loire wines are so expensive. There's just not that many of them. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. Loire's meticulous approach applies to winemaking as well. There's a strict selection that takes place at harvest, and the grapes are hand harvested and carefully placed in small containers and then transported to the winery in refrigerated trucks at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They want to be extremely careful with the fruit to preserve the native yeast that's on it. This is so because Lalou firmly believes that native yeast will help the grapes faithfully express their terroir much more so than if they use commercial yeast for fermentation. Once the fruit arrives to the winery, there's another strict selection that takes place on the sorting table. The highest quality of fruit that survives the selection process is placed in whole bunches into open vats without destemming or crushing. A long, slow fermentation will follow, and Lalou will use a gentle extraction technique such as a pump over as needed once the fermentation begins. Following fermentation, Lalou's wines are matured in 100% new French oak. The wines are racked once following malolactic fermentation and spend anywhere from 14 to 18 months maturing in barrel. After that, they're bottled without fining or filtration. This is what can give Lalou's wines a distinctive appearance, especially right after they're poured. So Lalou's approach is definitely characterized as minimal intervention winemaking. Then Lalou's wines remain in bottle at the winery until she decides that they are ready to be released. So there's no set release schedule that's followed. The tasting experience with Lalou wines can be absolutely mind-blowing. One of the things I like best about Lalou's wines is the incredible vibrancy and intensity of the aromatics. There can be red fruits such as raspberries, cherries, and blackberries. And then there's also more subtle, delicate floral notes such as violets and roses. You can get some earth and forest floor, and also some spice such as clove, cinnamon, or Asian five-spice. Despite their power and concentration, Lalou wines can be incredibly elegant. While it seems like an oxymoron, I like to describe the wines as being intensely ethereal. And in fact, as you're experiencing the wine, you really find it hard to believe that something with so much power and concentration can be so elegant, and vice versa. There's tremendous balance between the ripe fruits, the acidity, and the fine-grained tannins. This results in a silky, velvety texture and an extraordinarily memorable mouthfeel. Some of the wines also express a mineral quality, which adds an extra level of depth and sophistication. Lalou wines also have an extraordinarily long finish. The flavors persist on your palate for 45 seconds to a minute in many instances, especially with the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru wines. Lalou wines are also capable of aging extraordinarily well, and with extended bottle age, they become even more complex as they develop tertiary flavors and aromas that can include leather and truffle. Due to the tremendous complexity and amazing drinking experiences they provide, Lalou wines are in extremely high demand. But unfortunately, since they only make on average around 2,700 cases of wine per vintage, there's an extreme imbalance between the supply and demand. By contrast, Lafite produces around 35,000 cases per vintage. So Lalou generally produces less than 10% of the wine that's produced by Lafite. For that reason, Lalou wines can be incredibly expensive. They can range in price from anywhere for a couple $100s for one of the appellation wines, perhaps in a weaker vintage, to tens of thousands of dollars for some of the Grand Crus. For that reason, I found that one of the best ways to be able to enjoy Lalou wines is to assemble a wine tasting group with like-minded wine enthusiasts and then arrange to either source the wine, each chipping in some money for the purchase, or perhaps each person contributing a bottle from their cellar if they already have some. Of course, if you can afford one of the wines on your own, it's also an outstanding idea to buy one of the wines and then enjoy it over the course of the evening, because that way you can see how it evolves over the night. I have found instances, for example, where some of the wines may have started out as not being particularly impressive, but we just left it alone for 2 or 3 hours, and then it radically transformed into one of the most amazing wines of the entire night. So whenever you open Lalou wines, make sure that you're extremely patient with them and that you give them plenty of time to evolve over the course of the evening. Just to give you an example of the type of group tasting that can be possible, a couple years ago, my wine tasting group got together and we enjoyed 3 bottles of village wines from the 2004 vintage. This vintage was significant because, as mentioned earlier, Loire declassified all the Grand Cru and Premier Cru fruit and put that fruit into these village wines. And so for that 2004 vintage, we were able to do a comparison tasting with the 3 top wines produced by Loire that particular vintage. If you're a fan of high-end Burgundy and want to learn about Domaine della Romanée-Conti, be sure to check out this video that's linked above.